Today on our 2017 Chevrolet Silverado 2500, we're going to be taking a look at and installing the Curt Custom Fifth Wheel Installation Kit, part number C16411-204. So here's what our rails look like fully installed. They're going to allow us to mount a fifth wheel trailer hitch and pull a fifth wheel trailer. And when we're not towing with our fifth wheel, we can go ahead and pull the hitch out. And with the hitch out of the bed, we're only going to be taking up about 1 inch of vertical space in our truck bed. Now this is a custom fit application, so it's going to cut down the installation time and require less drilling than most universal kits. Now these are designed to work with most industry standard above the bed fifth wheel hitches. Now this is also going to work well with several different gooseneck adapters, which is going to be nice if you don't want to cut a big hole in the middle of your bed. That's going to feature a carbide powder coat finish, which is going to complement any colored truck. Now we've gone over some of the features, let's show you how we get it installed. To begin our installation, we're going to take a few measurements. Now, the numbers are in the kit, in the instructions, and depending on if you have a long bed or a short bed truck, those measurements might be a little bit different. So I'm going to go ahead and make a few marks so I know where my measurements are. I'm going to go across the bed, that way I know it's going to be nice and level. Now that we have our measurements marked out, we're going to take the flat edge of our rail here and we're going to lay it down right on where we just made those marks. And now we're going to need to measure our rail and the width of our bed and make sure that we're nice and centered. So once you have your rail put into position, then go ahead and find the center point and make any adjustments on where your rail needs to be. Next, we can go ahead and take a paint marker and we have everything centered up. I'm going to mark out the outermost holes of these square holes as well as the center one, and on this bar we're going to be marking towards the rear of the truck. With our holes marked, we're going to move our rail out of the way. And using a 1/8 drill bit, I'm going to drill some pilot holes where I just marked. Now you're going to want to try to get it as centered as you can. Now we're going to repeat that with all the marks that we made. Now we're going to come to the side of our frame here, and I'm going to take my frame bracket, and this is the driver's side. The way we're going to know the difference between the driver's side and the passenger side is with these tabs going in towards the truck. We're going to have this square cut and almost an angle, and that's going to go towards the rear, and on the front it's going to be more rounded. Now we're going to take our bracket, we're going to go up in between the frame and the bed, and it's going to mount right here. So I'm just going to take some loose hardware, and for now I'm just going to put it in the slots of the frame to hold it in position. Now to make sure that everything's lining up, I'm going to take my drill bit that I used to drill my holes. I'm going to poke it through, then I'm going to go back underneath the truck and make sure that I can see my drill bit going through the bracket and the bed of my truck. That way I know everything's lined up. And once we do this for the driver's side, we're going to go to the passenger side and do the same thing and make sure everything's nice and square. Now that we know that our rails are centered on our truck, I'm going to come back with a step drill bit. Let me drill all the pilot holes that I drilled out to a 9/16 hole. Now we're going to drill all the rest of the remaining holes out as well. We can go ahead and take our frame bracket again. Now that the holes are drilled out, we can loosely put it into position. Now we're going to start out with a M14 bolt, followed by a 5/8 washer, lock washer, and then finally a 5/8 flat washer. Now we're going to raise this into position, and if we look at our frame, we're going to have an oval hole towards the front. We're going to be using the threaded hole here and lining up our two holes in our bracket with these two holes. So we line up our bracket, we can take our hardware, loosely put it into place. Then we can come to the back threaded hole, put our rear hardware in. Now we can do the same thing on the passenger side with our passenger side frame bracket. Now we can come back into our bed and we're going to take our mounting bracket here. We're going to line it back up with the holes that we drilled. We're going to take our hardware. We're going to take a 1/2-inch carriage bolt. We're going to put it through our bracket. But before we do, as you can see here on the edge here, our hole is actually below the rib. And they provide us with some spacers. And we're just going to slide it underneath. That way when we put our bolt in, we don't have to worry about crushing the bed, crushing the ribs on our bed. It'll give us some extra support. So anywhere that the rail is not perfectly flush with the rib, go ahead and put that spacer in, and we're going to put our carriage bolt through all the holes that we drilled. Now with our first rail and hardware in place, we're going to come underneath, and we're going to take one of these square spacer blocks, followed by a 1/2-inch flange nut, and we're going to tighten everything up with our hardware coming through. It might be a little bit hard to see, but this is going to be the end result with a plate underneath and our flange nut holding everything in place. Now with that one in place, we're going to put the rest of our hardware and all the other remaining bolts. Our center bolt here, just like I mentioned before, is in a middle section of the rib. So underneath, we're going to take our spacer block. We're going to go around the bolt like that. Then we're going to come back with a square hold spacer. We're going to put it on top of that. And then finally, we're going to tighten it up with a 1/2-inch flange nut. We're just going to put everything loosely in place right now so we don't have to worry about our hardware falling out. Now that we have our front mounting bracket and our frame brackets in, we went and put our 5th wheel in that we're going to be using, and that's going to determine where our second mounting plate is going to be mounted. So what we're going to do is we're going to lift up on here and put it into the slots on our other bracket towards the rear, and that'll give us the exact location, and then we can mark and drill our holes. And once we have our 5th wheel in place, we want to make sure that our mounting bracket is square with our truck bed and it's not crooked or misaligned. And we can go ahead and mark our holes, but with our rear plate here, we're not going to be using the outermost holes. We're going to be using the second ones on the inside. And if we come to the center, we're going to be using the hole that's closest to our tailgate. So now we have all these marked out. I'm going to go ahead and lift up my 5th wheel, slide this out of the way so I can go ahead and start drilling my holes. I'm going to go ahead and drill my pilot holes again, and then come back and enlarge them to a 9/16 hole, just like we did with the front rail. With our holes enlarged and drilled, we can go ahead and put our rail back in place. And again, we want to make sure that our holes line up, and if we need to, we can go ahead and use our spacers, but since this is on the rib, we can just go ahead and drop down our hardware into the hole. Now we're going to put our hardware in place just like we did with our other bracket. First, we're going to have our U-shaped spacer go around our bolt, followed by a square hold spacer, and then finally we're going to follow it up with our 1/2-inch flange nut. Again, we're just going to put all this hand tight for now just so we don't lose our hardware. Now we can do the hardware on the sides. Now on our side plate, we're going to take one of our square plate washers here. We're going to go up over the stud, and then we're going to follow it up with our 1/2-inch flange nut. And we're going to repeat the same process for all the remaining hardware. Now on the rear here, you can see there's quite a bit of a gap on our plate here. And to prevent the ribs in our bed from crushing, we're going to take more of those U-shaped spacers. We're just going to slide them into place right around our bolt. That way when we tighten it up, we don't have to worry about crushing the ribs in our bed. With everything loosely in place, we can come back, and using a 3/4 inch socket, I'm going to tighten down all my 1/2-inch hardware to the specified amount in the instructions. And we're going to repeat that process for the remaining hardware we have left. With all of our 1/2-inch hardware underneath our truck torqued, we're going to come back to our M14 bolts here, and we're going to torque them down to the specified amount in the instructions. And we're going to repeat that process for all the remaining hardware. And that'll finish up our look at the Curt Custom Fifth Wheel Installation Kit, part number C16411-204 on our 2017 Chevrolet Silverado 2500.
Click the link below to shop, learn more, or visit us at eTrailer.com.